Chapter 2. The First Sign of Divine Erasure. The whispers began quietly in Eldoria, almost unnoticed at first. Over time, they grew stronger and became a common topic in both public discussions and private conversations. The concerns started with the agricultural groups. For generations, they had relied on the blessings of Erasure, the god of the harvest, as a source of prosperity. His image hung in their halls, and festivals were held each year to pray for abundance. This year, however, the harvest was poor. The crops were weak, and the total yield was less than half of what had been expected. At first, people blamed harsh weather or disease. But as the whispers spread, a new explanation took hold: Erasure was being forgotten. The drought of faith, as some called it, was not limited to the farming regions. In the coastal cities, where life depended on the sea, similar concerns began to grow. For centuries, sailors and fishermen had prayed to Meris, the goddess of the seas, trusting her to guide their ships and provide a good catch. Now, boats were returning empty more often, and fishermen faced increasing hardship. The fishing grounds that once supported the cities seemed depleted. Marketplaces that were usually busy with fresh seafood grew quiet. Even the temples of Meris saw fewer visitors, and offerings declined. Many began to wonder if the goddess's favor had been withdrawn. Scholars in the great archives first dismissed these events as normal social changes. However, as they gathered more reports, they reached a more troubling conclusion. Temples dedicated to several minor deities reported clear declines in attendance and offerings. Statues that were once carefully maintained were now left dusty and neglected. Festivals that had once drawn lively crowds were either cancelled or carried out with little enthusiasm, as people seemed less committed to the rituals. It was more than a decline in worship. Something seemed to be fading. The portraits of the gods appeared duller, and the temple lamps burned less steadily. The atmosphere in these sacred places felt different, as if something that had once been present was now missing. Some sensitive individuals claimed they could sense a growing emptiness, describing it as a presence that slipped away the moment they tried to focus on it. Most people, raised in strong traditions of worship, believed the gods were angry. When faced with hardship, they promised greater devotion and more offerings. This explanation was widely accepted and rarely questioned. However, a small group of scholars began to doubt this view. After studying records and comparing events, they noticed a clear pattern. The decline did not seem random. Instead, it appeared organized and gradual, as if something was deliberately causing the fading. In the quiet chambers of the great archives, Elara became increasingly focused on these troubling findings. While her colleagues continued their routine work of preserving historical records, more scholars began turning to older texts. They searched for writings about the relationship between mortal belief and divine power, and the consequences of breaking that bond. In their discussions, a more unsettling idea emerged, one more alarming than divine anger: divine erasure. The idea was controversial and had once appeared only in obscure myths. According to this theory, the gods were not immortal in the usual sense. Their power and existence depended entirely on the faith and memory of their followers. Their names and stories lived within the shared beliefs of the people. If those names stopped being spoken and those stories were forgotten, then the gods themselves would begin to fade. Master Lorian often spoke quietly with Elara as they worked. "It is not only a matter of disappearing faith, Elara," he would say. "The texts speak of a power that can actively unmake. A force that can pluck a name from the celestial curtains, and with it, the deity it represents. Imagine a god whose existence is tied to the grain we sow or the fish we catch. If that god is truly erased, not just forgotten, but made non-existent, then the very foundations of those things would crumble." He pointed to a fragile scroll showing the pantheon of Eldoria. "Look at Erasure, the harvest lord. His power is rooted in the cultivation of the land. If his name is erased from every scroll, song and prayer, then the understanding of his role, of his blessing, begins to fade. And when that understanding fades, reality follows. The crops fail not because Erasure is angry, but because the divine framework that sustains them has been deliberately disconnected." Elara, who was used to translating ancient texts and working with clear facts, found these discussions unsettling but hard to ignore. Learning that her own family name appeared on a list rumored to be marked for oblivion made the issue personal. She began to view events around her differently. The quiet meetings of city elders, the worried statements from priests, and the increased patrols of the Imperial Guard no longer seemed like ordinary unrest. Instead, they appeared to be signs of a deeper and more deliberate threat. She began comparing records of failing blessings with lists of deities whose temples had declined or whose festivals had stopped. The pattern was clear. The gods who were being forgotten were linked to the areas now facing unusual problems. A minor god of hearth and home, rarely mentioned anymore, was associated with homes that felt cold and unwelcoming. A forgotten goddess of journeys, once honored by travelers, was now linked to a rise in disappearances and accidents on the roads. The implications were overwhelming. This did not resemble the natural decline of faith seen in past eras. Instead, it seemed deliberate and precise, as if someone were intentionally removing the foundations of divine existence. The scholars who supported this theory spoke cautiously and only in private. In the deepest rooms of the archives, they shared their concerns in low voices. To suggest active divine erasure risked being accused of heresy, madness, or questioning the very structure of Eldoria's world. Still, the evidence continued to grow. An elderly scribe reported something unusual about the oldest celestial charts. The constellations were still visible, but the names written beside them seemed harder to recognize. He explained that the fading was not physical. Instead, the names felt less clear in his memory, as though recalling them required unusual effort. The stars themselves remained unchanged, but the connection between the stars and the beings they represented seemed to be weakening. Another scholar studying ancient creation myths noticed troubling inconsistencies. Stories that once clearly described the roles of the firstborn gods now seemed incomplete. Key figures and events appeared missing or altered, as though parts of the narrative had been carefully removed. He began to worry that even the act of copying and preserving these texts might be contributing to the problem. If the original sources had already been changed, then every new transcription could unknowingly continue the erasure. The theory strengthened when a former priest of Erasure, exiled for heresy, secretly sent a coded message to the archives. He claimed that his order had deliberately removed records of Erasure, not by destroying them, but by altering them. According to him, they had rewritten historical accounts, adjusted stories of divine intervention, and replaced Eradore's name with vague references to divine favor. This, he argued, was the true method of erasure, not open destruction, but gradual revision. Over time, the god's presence disappeared from memory, leaving only an absence where he had once been. This chilling discovery sent a fresh wave of dread through the small circle of scholars who had begun to suspect the truth. If the erasure was being conducted through such careful means, through the quiet manipulation of knowledge itself, then the very collections of that knowledge, like the great archives, were not just sanctuaries, but potential battlegrounds. Every scroll, every parchment, every inscription, could be a target. Every scribe, a potential innocent collaborator or a future victim. Elara felt a knot of fear settle in her stomach. Her family name, once just part of Eldoria's history, now seemed tied to something much larger. The old scroll she had discovered no longer felt like a simple curiosity. If names were truly being erased, then her lineage, and perhaps her own existence, might also be at risk. The quiet corner of the archives no longer felt safe. The silence seemed heavy, and the whispers about oblivion no longer sounded like distant rumors. They felt like signs of a crisis already in motion, one that had reached her directly. Even the familiar scent of parchment no longer brought comfort.